Welcome to Horror God. I hope the story will give you pleasant nightmares. Sit back, relax, and let the fear consume you.
The Cleveland Torso Murderer, also known as the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, was an unidentified serial killer who was active in Cleveland, Ohio in the 1930s. The killings were categorized by the dismemberment of 12 known victims and the disposal of their remains in the impoverished neighborhood of Kingsbury Run, called the Roaring Third or Hobo Jungle, known for its bars, gambling dens, and brothels. Despite an investigation of the murders, which at one time was led by famed lawman Elliot Ness, then Cleveland's public safety director, the murderer was never apprehended. The official number of murders attributed to the Cleveland Torso Murderer is 12, although recent research has shown there could have been as many as 20. The 12 known victims were killed between 1935 and 1938. The victims of the Torso Murderer were usually drifters, whose identities were never determined, although there were a few exceptions. Victims number 2, 3, and 8 were identified as Edward Andressy, Florence Polilio, and possibly Rose Wallace. Edward and Florence were both identified by their fingerprints, while Rose Wallace was tentatively identified via her dental records. The victims appeared to be lower-class individuals, easy prey in the Depression-era Cleveland. The Torso Murderer always beheaded and often dismembered the victims, occasionally severing the victim's torso in half and severing their appendages. In many cases, the cause of death was decapitation or dismemberment itself. Most of the male victims were castrated. Some victims showed evidence of chemical treatment being applied to their bodies, which caused the skin to become red, tough, and leathery. Many of the victims were found after a considerable period of time following their deaths, occasionally in excess of a year. In an era when forensic science was largely in its infancy, these factors further complicated identification, especially since the heads were often undiscovered. Elliot Ness did contribute to the arrest and interrogation of one of the prime suspects, Dr. Francis E. Sweeney. In addition, Ness personally conducted raids into hobo shanties and eventually burned down Kingsbury Run, from which the killer took their victims. His reasoning for burning down the shanty towns was to catalog fingerprints to easily identify any new victims, and stated that it was also done to get possible victims out of the area in an attempt to stop the murders. At one point in time, the killer taunted Ness by placing the remains of 2 victims in full view of his office in the city hall. The man who Elliot Ness believed was the killer would also provoke him by sending him postcards. Authorities interrogated around 9,100 people during the investigation to find the Torso Murderer. The case became the biggest police investigation in Cleveland history. Many were investigated, and 1,000 crimes were solved from the dedicated police investigations. There were only 2 main suspects of the Torso Murderers, Frank Dolezal and Francis E. Sweeney. On August 24, 1939, a Cleveland resident named Frank Dolezal, 52, white male, was arrested as a suspect in the Florence Polilio's murder. He later died in suspicious circumstances in the county jail and was exonerated of involvement in the torso slayings. Dr. Francis E. Sweeney, born on May 5, 1894, was a veteran of World War I, who was part of a medical unit that conducted amputations in the field. After the war, Sweeney became an alcoholic due to pathological anxiety and depression derived from his wartime experiences. Additionally, during his military service, Sweeney was gassed in combat, which resulted in nerve damage. Sweeney was later personally interviewed by Elliot Ness, who oversaw the official investigation into the killings in his capacity as Cleveland's safety director. During this interrogation, Sweeney is said to have failed to pass 2 very early polygraph machine tests. After Sweeney committed himself, there were no more leads or connections that police could assign to him as the possible suspect. From his hospital confinement, Sweeney sent threatening postcards and harassed Ness and his family into the 1950s. The postcards only stopped arriving after his death on July 9, 1964. Sweeney was a viable suspect, but the evidence was circumstantial and would have no bearing. In 1997, another theory postulated that there may have been no single butcher of Kingsbury Run, that the murders could have been committed by different people. This was based on the assumption that the autopsy results were inconclusive. Therefore, the only thing known for certain was that all the murder victims were dismembered. Elliot Ness was said to have taken the killer's identity to his grave.